Hello, everybody. It's really lovely to welcome you to the first London Shakespeare seminar of the 2021 academic year online, a new format for us. And it's great to have so many of you with us here this evening. I'm Sarah Lewis, and I'm a lecturer in early modern literature at King's, and I'm one of three colleagues convening the London Shakespeare seminar this year. So Gillian Woods, who's here with us now, do you want to wave, Jill? From Birkbeck Uni of London, and Jennifer Young from the University of Greenwich. So many of you will be familiar with the format of the London Shakespeare seminar, having attended seminars at Senate House in London in the past. But it's great to be able to include participants from further afield in this new online format. And I just want to spend a quick minute explaining how these seminars work and just say a little bit about the Zoom webinar platform, which is what we're using today. So we'll hear from both our speakers, who'll be speaking for about 20 to 25 minutes each, and then questions will come at the end of their papers as usual. Please type your questions using the Q&A function. There should be a little Q&A button at the bottom of your screens during the paper presentations. And please don't raise your hand or switch your camera or mic on, obviously, during the talks. If you'd like to ask your question yourself by switching on your mic when I call on you at the end of the papers, please indicate that you'd like to do that when you post your question, and then I can just unmute you and you can ask your question yourself. Alternatively, I can read it out for you if you prefer. Either is absolutely fine. Hoping, obviously, to get in as many questions as we can and have a good discussion at the end of the papers, but we don't want to keep our speakers for too long. So we'll plan for about 15 minutes of questions. So we should finish by 6:45, I think, at the latest. Also, just to say, if you'd like to tweet about the seminar, please use the hashtag #LondonShakes. Very many thanks to Hassan and Musa for coming up for that hashtag. I really like it. So #LondonShakes. I'm not a Twitter user, so it's all a bit new to me. So thanks everyone for being here. It's a real pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. They were both scheduled to speak in the spring, but for obvious reasons that wasn't possible. So it's really pleasing to be able to welcome them both today and to kick off this year's programme with their papers, which in different ways focus on editing, performing and printing, all three of those things. So Andrea Stevens is an Associate Professor of English, Theatre and Medieval Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She is the author of Inventions of the Skin, The Painted Body in Early English Drama, EUP 2013. More recent work includes an edition of William Hemming's 1639 play, The Fatal Contract, for the new Routledge Anthology of Early Modern Drama, 2020, and an adaptation of Titus Andronicus performed at the Cranach Centre for the Performing Arts in October 29 and directed by Robert Anderson. Jennifer Richards is the director of Newcastle University's Humanities Research Institute. She's published several books, the most recent of which is Voices and Books in the English Renaissance, A New History of Reading with OUP 2019. And she's also a general editor of the new critical edition of Thomas Nash, forthcoming with OUP in 2022. Okay, I'll now hand over to Andrea, whose paper is titled Classifying, Editing and Performing William Hemming's The Fatal Contract. So Andrea, I'm going to make you the host.
Great.
So you can share your screen.
Great, yeah, just bear with us a bit while we share. Let's see if this works. Okay. And then, folks, don't look, I'm showing the end of the talk here. So let's do, whoops, sorry. There we go. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much, Sarah and everyone, for organizing this. I was supposed to be there last February, and of course I would much rather be in London in person than sitting in my living room in Champaign, Urbana, after not having traveled for like the last 9 months. But we do what we can. I've adapted and tweaked this talk a little bit for the online format. I've made it shorter. And since February, so since my planned visit, the play that I'm talking about has actually come out in print. So it's now available from Routledge, as Sarah mentioned. I should also say that the title of the talk has the word performing in it. Right before the pandemic, I was meant to direct a staged reading of this play, but of course that was canceled. And I don't really talk, I'll mention performance at the end of the talk, but as will become very clear from the talk itself as I describe the play, it's a very vexed question about whether to perform this play at all or how to perform it. And I'll come back to that topic at the very end of the play, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. So let's get started. Little sustained attention has been paid to William Hemming's 1639 rape-revenge tragedy, The Fatal Contract. The play was successful in its own time, but scholars of early modern drama have since tended to dismiss it. For Virginia Vaughan, the play is a melodramatic failure. For Donald McGinn, it's the most obvious and detailed example of plagiarism of Hamlet in the 17th century. There is no question that the play is full of passages and motifs from dozens of early modern plays, especially but not exclusively those of Shakespeare. To view it through the lens of plagiarism, however, is to misunderstand early modern habits of composition, to ignore the play's literary merits, to lose the insight it offers into playwriting and theatrical production in the late 1630s, and above all, to neglect its unusual take on the convention of racial masquerade on early English stages. The Fatal Contract features one of the more singular characters in early modern drama, the villainous African eunuch, Castrato, who turns out to be a white woman, Clotilda, who has disguised her race and her gender to avenge her own rape. The challenge of the play is its tone. It's no accident that when I've tested versions of my edition with my undergraduates, they inevitably insist that the play is not a tragedy at all, but perhaps instead a deliberate joke. And by the time we get to the fifth act, they usually ask, quite angrily, quite often, "What is this that you just made us read?" This is not a frivolous or unreflective reaction, but rather a legitimate critical response elicited by what are some shocking fifth act revelations. The answers to these questions, what is this text, what are its intentions, can be addressed in part by considering Hemming's combination in this character of the eunuch of at least 4 to 5 stock characters from medieval to late Caroline drama. The vice figure, the African stage villain, the revenger, the raped woman whose violation drives plots but who rarely acts on her own, and finally the maid as Moor, a white European woman who temporarily masquerades as an African. This talk falls into 3 parts. I'll begin with some general remarks about the Fatal Contract and Hemming's background before focusing on his invention of Castrato Clotilda and setting up for those who have not read this play, the fifth act twist my students found so shocking. To explain the shift, I'll need to talk more about this convention of the maid as Moor. As I'll discuss in part 2, this trope features in a cluster of plays and court performances from the 1630s that, I argue, are geared to elite women and associated with the court of Queen Henrietta Maria, the French Catholic wife of King Charles I. I'll conclude by returning us to the Fatal Contract and Hemming's potentially transgressive adaptation of this genre of the maid as Moor. So part 1. Born in 1602, Hemming was the son of Shakespeare's first folio editor, John Hemming, and therefore belonged to the second generation of English theater professionals, so to speak. Hemming grew up watching and reading plays, and his biographer, Carol Morley, suggests that he probably also helped his father prepare Shakespeare's first folio for publication. Hemming therefore embarked on a career as a dramatist with a set of tools earlier playwrights such as Kidd and Marlowe did not have: a robust archive of plays available to consult in print, to say nothing of his own memories as a playgoer. As a writer, Hemming approached all of English theater as a rich repository of theatrical bits, special effects, inset spectacles, plot devices, and characters to be taken up at will. The play has everything in terms of surplus spectacle, from ghosts to onstage fires to pseudo-Catholic musical dumb shows to episodes of graphic violence, as we shall see. For the reader, surely part of the pleasure of encountering it is to recognize familiar quotations and dramatic situations pushed in radically unfamiliar directions. It is therefore tempting to think of Hemming as presciently postmodern, given his fondness for recycling and pastiche, and certainly prescient in his obsession with the performativity of such essential categories as race and gender. The predatory eunuch is really the aristocratic Clotilda in disguise. Clotaire, the crown prince and eventual king of France, is forever dissolving into teary fits of the mother, as the play names his chronic emotional instability. Far from fixed categories, then, race and gender are mutable and require constant performance to be legible. The play was, of course, written for the English theatre at a time when the boy actors who played women's parts were increasingly the subject of controversy, and the play is preoccupied to the point of obsession with the prosthetics, especially wigs and breasts, that create the illusion of femininity. Hemming's eclectic approach to composition creates significant tonal dissonances that make this play unusually difficult to classify, at least for us. The dedication, printed in the 1653 quarto, calls it, quote, a curiosity of wit and language. Ostensibly a tragedy, at times the fatal contract swerves into black camp, seeming to court the audience response of horrid laughter as much as the cathartic emotions of pity and fear Aristotle, for instance, thought proper to the experience of tragedy. Of course, we all know that early modern tragedies don't necessarily behave according to rigid standards of decorum. You just need to think about the Revenger's tragedy or even Romeo and Juliet to know this. But as a reader and especially as an editor, I kept struggling with this question of whether this was sincere in some sense, whether it was a straight tragedy or whether it was a deliberate parody. The plays now, the edition's in print, and I'm still struggling with this question. A very brief plot summary. The play is set in the French court, where the villainous Queen Fredegond is plotting against her husband and two sons, Clotaire and Clovis, to install her lover as the King of France. Fredegond's additional grievance is that her own brother was murdered in retaliation for the rape of the aristocratic Clotilda, when in fact it was the Queen's oldest son, Clotaire, who committed the act. To avenge her brother, Fredegond has had the majority of Clotilda's family killed, and Clotilda herself is presumed to be lost or dead. These events take place before the time scheme of the play, and we learn about this backstory, in my view, in the greatest possible way. Fredegond keeps a tapestry that shows in its weaving how she took her revenge, and as she tells the story, she pulls out the tapestry and she stabs it on stage. And there's the stage direction, draw the curtain and show the picture. This picture, drawn by an Italian, which still I keep to whet mine anger, does represent the murder of my brother for ravishing this beauteous piece of ill, a bloody and a terrible mistake to murder Clodomir for Clotaire's fact, for which behold how Fredegond's revenged. The Queen's preferred minion is her African servant, the eunuch Castrato, secretly Clotilda, and possibly the only cross-dressed and black-faced revenger to appear on the early modern stage. Moreover, and unusually for early modern drama, this disguise deceives not just the stage characters within the fiction, but also the audience. Johnson's Epicene is perhaps the most famous example of a surprise disguise device. For the majority of the action, Castrato, also simply called the eunuch, behaves as a typical vice figure or villain along the lines of Aaron from Titus Andronicus and Iago from Othello. Like his Shakespearean predecessors, Castrato confides to the audience in any number of asides, taking joyful glee with his plan to, on all sides, play foul, and declaring his soul to be as black as his face. Castrato is present on stage when the audience for the first time hears the story of Clotilda, her disappearance, and the subsequent murder of her family on the Queen's orders. Upon hearing this story of violation and loss, which is to say, hearing her story, the eunuch expresses regret that he himself did not have a chance also to rape this lost Clotilda. That is, if only he were equipped as a man, he'd, quote, search the deserts, mountains, valleys, plains, till I had met Clotilda, whom by force I'd make to mingle with these sooty limbs, till I had got on her one like to me. To better perform his disguise, then, the eunuch raises the threat of miscegenation, and we can remember Othello and Iago's warning of courses for cousins and jennets for Germans. The revelation of the eunuch's true identity is only disclosed at the play's end, and crucially requires a wrenching shift in sympathy to accept. By Act 5, we've seen him plot various atrocities, but for the most part, he works at a remove. He prefers poison, for example, to more intimate acts of violence. But mere moments before he confesses his true identity, the eunuch himself binds the play's tragic heroine, Ophelia, to a chair and then burns her breasts with a red-hot iron, the stage direction in the printed quarto indicating they bind her to the chair. The eunuch much sears her breast. And there you can see the photo citation. So not sort of sears, much sears her breast. Only in the wake of this sexual violence does Castrato start to peel back his layers of identity. He first confesses that he's been plotting against the French royal family the whole time. He next confesses that he's really Clotilda in blackface disguise. Finally, and only now perhaps speaking in her own voice for the first time in the action, Clotilda, still disguised as Castrato, confesses to a sudden upsurge of love for Clotaire, the very man she's been plotting against for the duration of the action. And here's the word, the eunuch. I should have killed thee, king, and had put on a masculine spirit to perform the deed. Alas, how frail our resolutions are. A woman's weakness conquered my revenge. Thou injuredst me, and yet I spared thy life. Thou injuredst me, and yet I would fall by thee, and like to my soft sex I fall and perish. This turn deserves emphasis. In the final moments of the fifth act, we are told in rapid succession that the eunuch is really Clotilda, and that Clotilda has fallen in love with her rapist. Neither do we ever see Clotilda in her own person. Like Viola in Twelfth Night, whose retrieval of her woman's weeds is deferred until after the play's end, the truth of the eunuch's feminine identity is narrated but never openly shown, a significant plot point to which I will return. The play concludes with the prospect of Ophelia, the eunuch/Clotilda, and the rapist King Clotaire buried together in the same tomb. Quote, take up the body of the king and these that for his love on either hand lie slain. They shall lie buried in one monument. Part 2, how do we make sense of this ending? The explanation for what otherwise seems an inexplicable shift from a revenge tragedy to the terrain of the sentimental can be found in the courtly, comic, and pastoral trope of the maid as Moor, a subgenre of English blackface performance that has yet to receive sustained scholarly attention. In other words, bear with me, I'll come back to the Fatal Contract and this moment in particular, but I first need to provide some context for Hemming's adaptation of his source material, and this context draws from my current book in progress, which is on this convention, and it's titled Racial Masquerade at the Caroline Court. As I mentioned earlier, this device of the maid as Moor can be found in a group of plays from the 1630s closely associated by circumstance of patronage, authorship, and performance venue to the Stuart Queen consort Henrietta Maria. And here they are, there's a list. Philip Massinger's early outlier Parliament of Love, Wilson's The Inconstant Lady, Wilde's Love's Hospital, Berkeley's The Lost Lady, Broom's The English Moor. In fact, I've highlighted them in red. Wilson's play as well as Wilde's are otherwise missed in comprehensive surveys of blackface performance on early English stages, so they tend not to even be included in the taxonomies of this convention that we have to date. To this list, we can also add court theatricals featuring blackface disguise plots such as William Montague's 1633 pastoral romance, The Shepherd's Paradise, performed by aristocratic women, among them Queen Henrietta Maria herself, rather than professional actors. Although the text of Montague's romance is rarely read now, Erica Vevers has shown how central it was to a Caroline mythology promoting chastity and the idealization of married love. The centrality of racial masquerade to the Queen's court throughout the 1630s has to date only been briefly addressed, and I'm thinking mainly of Karen Britlin and Sophie Tomlin's wonderful work on Queen Henrietta Maria's, the drama attached to her court. What's more, these plays have never really been assembled together and read as forming a coherent set. Finally, scholarship on early English theater has thus far neither really noted nor explained in detail why it is that by the Caroline period, plays featuring characters who are really African, Othello, have been largely displaced by plays featuring white characters disguised as Moors. In other words, characters, nearly always female, who are merely playing at being African within the fiction of the drama. Over the course of the 17th century, stage blackness therefore shifts from being an action that a man might play, so to speak, to one of the defining skills of the cosmeticized boy actor. Importantly, the discovery of the Black character's essential whiteness typically involves a theatrically striking change in appearance. On stage, the makeup may be partially breached. In some cases, we see it applied on stage in the first place. But off stage, the character removes the cosmetic disguise to re-enter triumphantly as white. Seeing the transformation happen within the scope of the performance is thus crucial to the genre. In these plots, such unveilings generally pave the way either for marriage or for the renewal of marital bonds after a strain or breach of marital fidelity. Here's one example from Berkeley's The Lost Lady, where you can see from the text the moment at which the character's disguise is literally partly washed away in front of the audience. The character is writhing in bed, she's been poisoned, and someone tends to her and rubs her face, and then they can see the disguise begin to fall away. The play then scripts an exit for her, and then she returns finally at the end of the play fully back in her primary white identity. As a group, these plays articulate a meaning for stage blackness quite different to what we see in earlier works featuring African characters whose identities remain stable. Rather, the Maid Moore plot draws upon how blackness signifies within the logic of anti-cosmetic discourse, where blackness, as a firm hue that cannot be altered or adulterated by other colors or substances, expresses constancy. Many of you may be familiar with Johnson's Masque of Blackness. You'll see this argument about blackness advanced in this court masque. So in this passage from Masque of Blackness, Niger celebrates his daughter's black beauty, seeing their skin color as evidence that they are beloved of the sun, the best judge and most formal cause of all dames' beauty, who shows that in their black the perfectest beauty grows, since the fixed color of their curled hair, which is the highest grace of dames most fair, no cares, no age can change, or there display the fearful tincture of a borrowed gray. And it continues. And again, I would say this masque is an important intertext for all of the Maid Moore plots that come in the Caroline era. The Maid Moore plays set this discourse of blackness as constancy into narratives about courtship and marriage, where physical blackness, even if temporary and cosmetic, comes to stand for chastity, fidelity to one lover, and the capacity for secrecy in matters of love. That on the surface, these associations of racialized blackness with chastity and constancy seem relatively harmless, if not positive, is in no way to suggest that the Maid Moore trope is progressive as we understand the term. Rather, the disguise of Moore is necessarily temporary, the theatrical and ideological work the fiction sustaining coming only at the moment the disguise is abandoned. What matters is that the disguise is ultimately removed and that its removal restores heterosexual romantic ties. It is still blackness in service of establishing norms of white beauty. In the interest of time, I'm not offering any representative instances from these plays. I'm happy to discuss the genre in the Q&A. If you're familiar with any of these plays, it's probably English Moor or maybe The Lost Lady. What I want to emphasize to you now, though, is that Hemming in the late 1630s inserts what was by that time a well-established comic, pastoral, and courtly convention into a genre, the rape-revenge tragedy, that then strains to accommodate it. Knowing this context is necessary to understanding why the fatal contract concludes as it does, by suggesting that the revelation of the eunuch's true identity, no matter how improbable, somehow restores the relationships between the play's men and women. I return now to where we left off, the fifth act and that scene of torture, the much searing of breasts that precedes the qualified undisguising this play offers. The eunuch reserves his most direct torments for Ophelia, who was engaged to the younger Prince Clovis, only to be compelled to marry Clotaire, now the King of France, after false reports circulate of Clovis's death. The fatal contract of the title is Ophelia's pre-engagement to Clovis, which, according to the play, renders her marriage to Clotaire incestuous once it is revealed that Clovis is in fact still alive. Both brothers turn on her for her supposed inconstancy, each at times fixating on how Ophelia's hitherto enticing feminine attributes, namely her hair and her breasts, have turned toxic with the revelation of her supposed duplicity. Iago-like, the eunuch stirs Clotaire's jealousy and convinces him to murder his wife on what is to be their wedding night. And the following speech I'm about to read should give you a sense of what I mean by the play's very distinct prosthetic obsession. Clotaire. "'Tis thou art altered. True, Ophelia, that whilst thy pure thoughts did awe thy will, I loved like an idolater. I was possessed that these two twins, these globes of flesh, contained all that was happy both on earth and heaven. In this I could descry the Milky Way, the maiden zone that girds the waste of heaven. In this the seat of paradise, and how the wanton rivulets played about the isle which puzzle yet geography. All this I could in thee, my sometime chaste Ophelia, find and rejoice in. But thou art now an undressed wilderness wherein I walk, losing myself amongst a multitude of beasts. O savage action, come, dispatch." At this point in the play, we're in the fifth act. The eunuch and Clotaire each then physically attack Ophelia, Clotaire dragging her by her hair, and the eunuch attacking her breasts. Here's the scene. And I've given it to you. You can sort of take a look at this passage. What I would want to emphasize is how the prosthetics of stage gender are physically attacked at this moment. In terms of the hair pulling, I would say that Hemming is probably drawing on Ford, anticipating she's a whore for that moment. The specific attack on breasts has, to my knowledge, no real precedent in early modern drama. I think it harkens back to some medieval saints plays. But it's really remarkable, again, how these prosthetics become part of the action. And again, I would emphasize the stage direction. And I don't really see, a strong precedent for this particular cue to action. They bind her to the chair. The eunuch much sears her breast. It's only now, at this moment, after this violence, that the layers of disguise start to unravel. Castrata first reveals that he's a revenger who has framed Ophelia for her infidelity and also murdered Queen Fredegonde and her lover, incidentally, whose dying bodies he now exposes, having earlier hidden them on stage in the discovery space. You can sort of start to imagine what's happening on stage visually at this moment. An outraged Clotaire stabs him, and only then does the dying Castrato finally reveal her true primary identity, along with her secret love of Clotaire, in the speech I quoted in full at the beginning of this paper. "I should have killed thee, king, but oh, how frail our resolutions are." We, the audience, again, are surprised by this as the stage characters. Hemming, however, chooses not to script an exit for a costume change for the eunuch, even though there would be multiple ways to show the disguise removed, at least in part, to say nothing of the fact that this company themselves performed the English Moor in 1637, so they would absolutely have the knowledge, the precedent, and the technology to be able to have some kind of costume change happen at this moment. But instead, the revelation is exposed via a letter read silently and then confirmed by Clotaire, who upon reading and learning the contents immediately repents of his past actions. He says, "Shall Clotaire live a captive to his brother, slave to sin, enthralled in wedlock that's incestuous, a ravisher and murderer of his friend? There's no way left to rid me but my sword of these ills at once. O wronged Clotilda," and at which point he kills himself. Thus is Castrato expunged and Clotilda purified in death, the acknowledgement of the eunuch's true identity, naturalizing femininity as passive, merciful, unthreatening, and ultimately forgiving of male sin, the breach of the disguise, even though there's no visual correspondent, erasing for everyone on stage, including Ophelia, 5 acts worth of violence. Ophelia also, in her dying words, forgives the eunuch. It is difficult to predict what 21st century audiences will make of this sudden turn to the sentimental. The turn is, however, utterly conventional in the sense that the other made as more plots Hemming draws upon each conclude in the same way, with the restoration of bonds between men and women. But the motif is always a pastoral or comic one, and by setting this device within a rape-revenge tragedy, adding the disguise of gender, and framing the Moorish persona as an exquisite vice figure who gleefully murders and tortures people, Hemming explodes the convention, even as he avoids showing Clotilda restored to whiteness, leaving instead the change of character to what we can only presume is a change in the actor's voice. These departures are significant. For a scandalized Fredson Bowers, quote, such a total confounding of all ethical judgment had never before been found in the Elizabethan tragedy of revenge. From one perspective, however, there's no ethical inconsistency here at all, but rather an almost slavish theatrical consistency. Clotilda behaves as she does because she's playing the part of a vice figure, as well as a Moorish villain, as well as a comic made as Moor. The scandal, if indeed there is one, is in the incompatibility of these personae. Taken in isolation, everything surprising that happens in the play is conventional. It's the combination of elements and motifs that makes the play so curious, to return to the introduction. The sheer scope of the play's pastiche is the reason I continue to struggle with whether this play is in fact a deliberate parody written by somebody who grew up in the industry. After all, we did not invent what we now describe as postmodernism. Simply to see the play as a meditation on antecedent drama, however, or to see it as a clever exercise written by a theatrical insider who wished to subvert well-worn stage conventions, even as he showcased his own deep knowledge of English theater, may not satisfy readers troubled by the play's depiction of sexual violence, of the essential villainy of blackness, of racial identity as a disguise of convenience. For some, no matter his intentions, what Hemming shows us might well be unbearable even by the standards of early modern tragedy, and ultimately irreconcilable to the expectation of horrid laughter or the aesthetics of camp. Let me say, as I close, that by now the challenge of performing this play should be obvious. How to, whether to stage it, whether to preserve the surprise disguise device for the audience. If there's time to consider the afterlife of this play and performance now, perhaps we can do so in the Q&A. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Andrea. That's fantastic. Please save your questions for the end. And just to remind you to type your questions into the Q&A function so that we've got some stacked up for the end of the session. So I'm going to hand over now to Jennifer Richards, whose paper is titled The Idea of the Sounded Book, Rethinking Print in Early Modern England. So I think, Andrea, do you need to enable Jenny as host? Oh, it seems to have worked. Fantastic.
Some reason, hold on, I can't see the how to share my screens because it's hidden. So.
We can see your screen.
I'll just do it. Well, it's okay. I'll do it like this. So in some ways, this paper is going to seem very different to Andrea's, but I want to pick up on something that Andrea said at the start and connect it to the kind of things I want to talk about. So Andrea, I was really struck by, right at the beginning, you started off by talking about the genre of the play. Is it a tragedy, or is it, as your students suggest to you, a joke? And I'm very interested in the way in which performance might keep that question open, and what happens when you edit a text, or whether it closes off options. So this is, I'm moving to prose and to print, but performance is always is very much part of the what I'm thinking about. And I don't mean performance in terms of a full stage dramatic presentation, but simply reading aloud, using the voice, perhaps using gesture. But if we could think about the voice a little bit more expansively and what it does to print in printed prose. So I'd like to tell you about a journey I've been on ever since I started to work seriously on Thomas Nash. In particular, how working on Nash has led me to look at the printed book differently. And I believe it's time to rethink the so-called material turn in literary studies and our expectations of physical books. I want to be clear, I'm not contesting work in the field of book history, which I greatly admire, but I do want to add a different dimension to it. This talk is focused on Nash, and I will be drawing on material from Voices and Books and thinking a little about what this means for how we are editing Nash for the OUP edition. But I'd also like to point you to the seed of an idea that underlies this paper, which is building from Voices and Books, that the interrelationship between print and performance needs more attention. If I had had research time, I actually wrote this in March, and I haven't had any more research time since then, I would have wanted to reflect on the early printing of play texts like Titus Andronicus, which I think do include performance-informed features in print, and to note that they were printed alongside ballads and other oral forms in printing houses like that of John Dantes, who also printed a lot of Nash's work. So I want to emphasize that there's a broad oral culture for print. And since this is, but I haven't had time, but since this is the London Shakespeare seminar, you might be able to fill in some of the gaps for me and teach me something when we get to questions. What I do want to do, though, is to argue for greater attention to the structure and punctuation of sentences in early prose and plays, because that, for me, has been one of the most useful ways of thinking about performance potential of texts. But of course, there are other ways too. I'm going to start with one of my favourite quotations about Nash and his antagonist, Gabriel Harvey, which will tell you something about his literary personality, as well as the features I want to bring to the fore, including in the edition I'm working on with Joe Black, Kate DeRaker, Andrew Hadfield, Kirsty Rolfe, Kathy Schrank, Rachel White, and all our wonderful editors. The author of this quotation is C.S. Lewis. And here he is reimagining a meeting between Harvey and Nash, who, by the way, never met outside the printed pamphlets. But he transposes this meeting to his own time. And here it is. He says, it's an encounter between a half-drunk street corner humorist and a respectable person, he says, say from People's. I always like that addition. It is useless, Lewis expands, for the respectable person to show that the charges brought against him are untrue, that he does not beat his wife, is not a cinema star in disguise, is not wearing a false nose. Lewis gets to the heart of these two writers' style. One is lively, quick-witted, edgy. The other is, well, respectable. I'm sure we all know who we think we would like more. And yet, despite this, it is Harvey who's received more attention in the last few decades. And I'm curious about why that is. For a start, I think it's because Nash is hard. And also, it's not always clear that studying him is worth the effort. Here is Lewis again. If asked what Nash says, Lewis says, we should have to reply nothing. He tells no story, expresses no thought, maintains no attitude. Actually, Lewis was not especially original in making this observation. It's just that he has a memorable turn of phrase. Harvey said something very similar in Pierce de Supererogation, 1593, predicting that Nash's books cannot possibly live because they do not contain anything useful. There is nothing that Harvey, a bookmarker by habit, can take away to store in his commonplace book. No pithy sayings, no sententiae. And then, having made that point, Harvey provides a list of books that he believes do have a future because they advance understanding of natural or moral philosophy. Arguably, Harvey has nothing to show off about either. His texts also did not live, and he is not widely read even among historically minded English Renaissance readers today. Yet something else did live, the material evidence that he left behind in his reading. Harvey left behind thousands of marks in books, coded symbols against passages he wanted to return to, underlinings in ink or red chalk, annotations in his very readable italic hand. His comments are illuminating. They date readings, they tell us who he read with or for, and they tell us also what he likes and dislikes. This is the visible evidence that can make us feel close to the past, not least because it promises to give us privileged insight into a reader's mind. In the case of Harvey, it really is not hard to see the link between his reading and writing, so you can find his commonplaces, things that he's underlined recurring in his writing. And that's even though his role as a professional reader or intelligencer, discovered by Lisa Jardine and Antony Grafton 3 decades ago, has privileged the former, his reading, over the latter, his writing. In contrast, Nash left behind no marginalia. The two that have been attributed to him are references to a play, Dr. Faustus, which he likely audited. But I don't know what they reveal about him, presuming that they are his, other than reinforcing his connection to his friendship with Marlowe. Nash says in Lenten Stuff that he kept a notebook, but this has not survived. And it's hard to know how deeply and widely he read, and that's a problem as we annotate Nash, we're coming up against all the time. Did he read? Did he collect? Did he reuse? Did he know? Did he understand what he was using? Many of the quotations he reuses may, as R.B. McCarrow notes, have come out of printed commonplace books, and there's a high degree of oral material in his writings. Proverbs that were in everyday use and Latin sententiae he probably spoke aloud and memorized as a schoolboy. J.P. Steen, the editor of the Penguin English Library edition of Nash's writing, 1972, thinks Nash relied a great deal on his memory, describing it as plentifully stored, but sometimes defective. There is great accuracy in some of his quotations, suggesting he may have copied them from a book he had to hand. And there's inaccuracy in others, presumably, I think, deliberately so, especially in the case of his Latin tags. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Caelum petimus stultitia, this is from Horace's Odes. In our folly, we aspire to the sky itself, translated by Jack Wilton in Unfortunate Traveller. Which of us all is not a sinner? Or their second example, Paulo Majora Canimus, let us sing a somewhat loftier strain. This is Virgil's Eclogues. And I love this, Wilton, well to the purpose. Other familiar sayings or proverbs seem to change shape and meaning in the mouths of untrustworthy speakers, like Wilton, the Unfortunate Traveller, making them unusable. So you can collect them, but that might be problematic. I won't go into that now. It's almost as if Nash is deliberately making it hard for us to mark and collect sentences to store for future use. I cannot help but imagine that he's provoking a reader like Harvey, whom he knew did read pen in hand. He talks about him scrawling on his pages. Other sentences change shape because they are live moments. They are not adapted familiar sayings, but original moments when a character is thinking out loud. And the source for these, I suggested in Voices and Books, is his experience of live theatre. My example of one such sentence is from Anatomy of Absurdity, 1589, Nash's earliest work, which seems to consist of nothing but collected quotations. At the start of this work, Nash complains about idlebees who select from their reading only what most serves their turn. An example of this bad habit, he says, is the writing of love poets who blot many sheets of paper in the blazing of women's slender praises, decorating their writing with sentences that suit their intention, which is to pass off their lust as virtue. And then Nash's answer to that is to show that he has read more by quoting lots of text, lots of misogynistic counterexamples. But that habit of cutting and pasting, he argues, lacks eloquence and thought. And that's debatable, that's just my reading. And he offers a solution with a series of adages right at the end of this book that emphasize humility, steadfastness, and most importantly, speaking and writing as you really think, and thinking as you speak or write. And here's just one example of that. That which we think, let us speak, and that which we speak, let us think. Let our speech accord with our life. But as soon as he's given all of these adages, more sentences of advice, he becomes aware that he is like one of the idle bees he criticizes, and he backtracks, making his advice, again, less easily repeatable by sharing his live thinking. And he does this, the character does this out loud, imagining we are at his side as he is writing and thinking in the moment about which book to recommend, then changing his mind as he does so. And if you don't mind, I'll read this out. Even now, I begin to bethink me of Mulcaster's position. So he's thinking about what can I recommend that you should follow. Even now, I begin to bethink me of Mulcaster's positions, which makes my pen here pause as it were at a full point, which pause has changed my opinion and makes me rather refer you to Ascham, the ancient of the two, whose praises seeing Master Grant so gloriously garnished, I will refer you to his works, and more especially to his schoolmaster, where he hath most learnedly censured both our Latin and Greek authors. So this is a text which is all about taking quotations from books to give advice. And he does that too, but at the point at which he has to choose and give advice, he dramatizes that moment of choice. Here, in this quotation, we meet Nash about to place a full stop, a full point, and he pauses, performing the act of thinking out loud. And when he pauses, he changes his mind. The full stop we are expecting becomes a comma, and the thought or sentence goes on a little longer. So it's that moment of change that he brings into his prose I find interesting. In Voices and Books, I borrowed a term used by theatre historians to describe this, the midline shift, which is used in a dramatic speech to create the impression of interiority and virtual presence. And Nash uses it to create a sense of movement and liveness in his prose. But it's not the only effect he borrows from the theatre to create sentences that dramatize a live moment. Even more powerful is his use of directed address. And in my next example, this time from Unfortunate Traveller, we find ourselves at Wilton's side, seeing a foolish victim through his eyes. Oh, my auditors. This is Wilton. Wilton's not a very nice character. I'm not sure if I can perform it in the voice it should be, but I'll do my best. Oh, my auditors, had you seen him, how he stretched out his limbs, scratched his scabbed elbows at this speech, how he set his cap over his eyebrows like a politician, and then folded his arms one in another, and nodded with the head, as who would say, let the French beware, for they shall find me a devil. Strong pause. I've highlighted the colon there so you can see the structure of the sentence. Strong pause. If, I say, you had seen but half the actions that he used of shrugging up his shoulders, smiling scornfully, playing with his fingers on his buttons, and biting the lip, pause, you would have laughed your face and knees together. This sentence asks us to hold in our mind two images of the captain. Wilton's victim, this sentence asks us to hold in our mind two images of the captain, Wilton's victim. He fancies himself as an intelligencer, the captain does, but he is an idiot. Wilton creates this impression by acutely observing his gestures. In the first colon, the first part of the sentence, which opens with the invitation, had you seen, the captain's gestures are those of someone who would say, let the French beware, for they shall find me a devil. Indeed, these are the same gestures that Wagner, Dr. Faustus's servant, performs as he is about to speak to a devil in a second report of Dr. Faustus. You can see that on the right. I don't need to read that out to you. In the second colon, this chiasmus, you had seen, so it's the rhetorical figure turns the phrase around. alerts us to a reversal of perspective. We now realize that the captain is speaking to just such a devil as he would like to be, Wilton. The captain is the coney, not the catcher. And this is also revealed. In the second list of gestures, which suggests the naive, exploitable character he's doomed to play. So he's becoming the gull. So what I've been showing you is how a sentence is structured for performance. This is a rhetorical punctuation with the pauses that follow the figures of speech that show you the reversal. So you kind of know how you, I don't think I've done it brilliantly, but it'll show, it does signal to you how it might be performed. And here's a cute, it's rhetorical punctuation. And he uses this three-part structure to sentences all the time. He uses them, including in the one play that we've got that's in his name, Summer's Last Will. But here's a curious point to note. It so happens that the structure of the sentence that I've been drawing your attention to was clarified in the second edition of Unfortunate Traveller, Quarto 2, as we call it, and most likely by Nash, who complains of the printing of that particular sheet in the first edition when he was absent from the printing house. Now, I'm coming towards my conclusion. I'll make more of that in a moment in terms of print and performance. So my question in this final part of this paper is, how does this sense of Nash's interest in live moments and the way in which he makes sentences move and come almost off the page, give us a sense of presence, how does that inform the way we are editing him for OUP, given that we are producing a hefty 6-volume edition in print? And I'm always struck by the things that you might lose when you edit somebody. You edit in order to make it an author accessible, but actually you might lose, but there's something that's really quite startlingly different about a loose pamphlet in the 16th century to a text surrounded by annotations such as ours will be. Right from the start of this project, we had a hunch that there was something performative about Nash's prose. Firstly, we wanted to respect that. Firstly, we've tried to gain a better understanding of Nash in the theatre and his relationship with key dramatists, including Marlowe. And recognizing that seems really important, given that Nash's writings have been a source of information for many theatre historians. He provides insight into the emotional impact of a staging on a grand scale, clues about lost plays, and information about the rehearsal process. So we know, even though he's a prose writer, he's fully immersed in the theatrical experience of the 1590s. Secondly, we have tried to animate his writing through different activities. An adaptation of Terrors of the Night for a Red Not Dead evening at the Sam Wanamaker Theatre, on which Kate DeRaker worked with the director, James Morrell, and a staging of Nash's show, Summer's Last Will and Testament by Edward's Boys in 2017, including in the place of its original performance. And thirdly, we are drawing attention to Nash's theatricality in our notes and in our editorial policy. Ours will be an old spelling edition, even though this runs against early advice we were given mainly by drama editors who worried that we were keeping Nash in doublet and hose. Those worries are not without reason, in part because so much drama is in modern spelling, modern punctuation. But there's other reasons too. Nash is incredibly challenging read. Moreover, R.B. McCarro's monumental 1904 edition was also old spelling. So what's different about what we would be doing? You might think that because of that, we would want to update it. And especially since in 1950, W.W. Gregg argued in Rational Copy Text, which is really important text for bibliographers, that had McCarro, who died in 1940, edited Nash at the end of his career, after he had published his advice on editing Shakespeare, he would have chosen the first edition, not the second edition, for Unfortunate Traveller. And that is based on the argument that accidental spelling and punctuation in a first edition are more likely to be closer to an author's original manuscript. And yet, as I suggested a moment ago, what we see as Nash's accidentals are more likely substantive changes, clarifying the structure of a live moment, and that it is not at all unreasonable to suppose, given the story he tells us in the errata of the first edition, that he was involved in the printing of the second. I conclude this paper by thinking briefly about the broader implications of this argument concerning Nash for the editing and teaching of early modern literary texts, drama, prose, poetry. I'm well aware that focusing on punctuation, those tiny marks that seem so erratically placed on the Renaissance page, manuscript or print, can appear a nerdy concern. I have to confess that I'm so used to the eye roll every time I mention commas and colons to my colleagues and fellow editors. But we would be better to think of those marks, I think, as prompts to reflect on the potential performance of a thought. And that's why I value rhetorical punctuation, and why I find the adherence to the modernizing of early modern texts a little too fixing. I think it stops us from playing with text out loud. And I would go back to the thing I said right at the start when I was responding, thinking about Andrea's paper, about what performance keeps open. I'm not alone, I hope, in thinking about this as important for drama as well as prose and poetry. And I'd like to end this paper by mentioning some like-minded work that I have found really helpful. They include, and this is not an exhaustive list, they include Bill Sherman's essay, Early Modern Punctuation and Modern Editions, Ros King's Seeing the Rhythm, Oliver Morgan's new book on turn-taking in Shakespeare, which has valuable things to say about the end comma, and the ongoing work that Michael Cordner at York University is doing, working with actors, exploring how differently punctuated texts sound, unpacking wordplay, tricky syntax, and more, but all out loud. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jennifer, for a fantastic talk. Thanks to both our speakers, in fact. Andrea, are you happy to put your camera back on? Hello, hi. So there are some questions in the Q&A, which I'll get to, but I wondered if maybe we could start with thinking about that question you posed, Jennifer, when you took over from Andrea after her paper. I was thinking about live moments towards the end of your talk and all the way through both talks, actually. So Nash evoking live moments in his prose, but also in the Fatal Contract, you know, these live moments which are all too live and raise questions of performability as a result. And yeah, that point you raised, Jennifer, that question about the stability or instability of genre, and whether performance can keep that instability open, that fluidity open, whereas editing potentially tends to close that fluidity down. And I just wondered whether you wanted to say, either of you, if you wanted to say a little bit more about
that. So for me, I would say that both, I was really struck by what you said, Andrea, right at the start. And I think that both of those readings are equally valid, and they would be could be realized in performance. And I suppose that because really, for me, working on the schoolroom and understanding how sentences might be performed out loud, not just read and collected, but how they might be used for people to practice vocal tone. And that when you change your tone, you change the emotion, you change the reading, and that would work for sentences, for paragraphs, for text as well. And that for me was is really important. But there's something else. When I was listening to Andrea's paper, I was starting to regret some of the examples I chose for my paper, because some of the material that you're dealing with, Andrea, is really, really difficult. and excruciating. And of course, Nash has got that as well. He's got some very, very challenging material. And I have found it very helpful to think about that. You know, you raise the question, is it sincere or not? But I have found it helpful with Nash to think of the text, the sentences and the passages performatively as well, where you get distance, where you're drawn in, where you're made uncomfortable, where you change perspective. And I've used thinking about the punctuation and the structure of the sentences that take you in, take you out again, to help me think that through a bit. But,
Thanks. Yeah, so in terms of me editing the Fatal Contract, it was a real challenge. So I think I was some of you may know the general editor, Jeremy Lopez, who prevented me. He would cut all the stage directions I kept, or all the glosses I kept wanting to add that would clarify tone. So he wanted all of us to take a really restrained editorial hand. So I only had the introduction to kind of raise these issues of tone, of sincerity, of how to approach this text. And really I had to be very, pick and choose my battles about what performance moments to kind of draw out in the glosses. So it was a real challenge in editing this text. And again, I think, which gets to it returns to the question of performance now as well. I'm not sure that this can be performed without such extensive contextual throat clearing, in other words, to prepare the audience for what they're going to see, that I just think it becomes really, really challenging for what it's worth.
Thank you both. I'm going to read out some questions from the Q&A. The first question came from Emma Whitday. Hello, Emma. She says, thank you, Andrea. That was absolutely fascinating. It's for you, Andrea, this question. She was really struck by how much the Fatal Contract seems to be in conversation with the White Devil in terms of racial masquerade, Francisco disguised as Mulinasa, and of course counterpointed by a real Moorish maid, Zanchi. And in terms of the stage direction about drawing a curtain and showing a picture. And I wondered if you had further thoughts on that. So so the relationship of the Fatal Contract to the White Devil, something she's picked up on.
Absolutely. So one of the pleasures of reading the Fatal Contract is if you know early modern drama, if you're familiar with the whole, not just Shakespeare, obviously, but all early modern plays, there are so many allusions and intertextual references that it can become a real pleasure in trying to isolate them. So I'd say that if you see an echo, it's absolutely there. Certainly it's there in this case. As for what I'd say about the White Devil, of course, is that this particular, so it's only after the 1620s at the very latest that you'll actually get disguises, like African disguises, that also get removed during the course of the performance. And I've written elsewhere about that. I address sort of some of the technical reasons for why that's so. So in the White Devil, I think that the costume is acknowledged, but not actually like removed or donned in the course of performance. So that's another, but certainly that's another thing that Hemming is riffing on. There's another play, and if someone might know this, it escapes me right now because there's actually an article on it where a portrait is stabbed. So there's a certain, I think somebody's written about this, right, where that's a stage convention unto itself, where at some point either a painting or a tapestry gets brought out and it's attacked on stage in a kind of ekphrastic or iconoclastic sort of moment. So again, Hemming, if it's happened on stage by 1638 when he writes this play, chances are to some degree the device is also in the play. I can't overstate enough the density of spectacle. So both spectacle as well as textual allusions to the plays that he clearly is consulting in print as he's composing the play. And so again, so some of the earlier 20th century critics just sort of fixate on the crime perpetrated against Hamlet in their eyes. They sort of see this play as an egregious adaptation or plagiarism of Hamlet, but it's everything. Everything is in there. And I keep meaning to kind of teach the play as a sort of capstone text in a survey of early modern drama. I think that would be a good way to kind of, it itself is sort of a meditation, again, on all performance up to this moment.
Thanks. Yeah, I was thinking about how The Fatal Contract, it feels like a commonplace play. It's a play that's kind of gathering together all of these conventions in the way that Nash is gathering together his quotes, and
but just very irreverently, with no regard to the original context of the quote that he's pulling out. So I think he gives the eunuch sort of like lines from Lavinia. I mean, and again, that I keep coming back to, we would now aesthetically look at that as pastiche, as parody, and so forth. But I always worry about whether that's me anachronistically applying sort of presentist concepts to the play when there might be other intentions. But then I also don't want to lose the possibility that this is a theatrical insider. Why, he'd be well equipped to write a play that deliberately kind of parodies earlier examples. So
thank you.
The jury is still out, in my opinion, on what this play is trying to do.
I'm going to pick out another question from the Q&A thread. So this is a question for Jennifer from Matthew Bladen. He says, thanks both for fascinating talks. He was really interested in the way you drew attention to the work of punctuation, indicating how a sentence might be performed, on slide 8 in particular. And he says it reminded him of at least modern pointing in texts of psalmody, indicating where to change notes and put stresses in musical performance. And he asks, do you know if there are any parallels in early modern psalmody or other musical textual notation?
The principle is the same, that the marks you've got on the page are you might read as prompts to perform. I don't think there's anything. I mean, with early modern psalms, you've got the caesura in the middle of the sentence, and I think that Neil Rhodes has argued that serves no performance function whatsoever, because you're not going to break the line in that way. But I did lots of work with Richard Wistrike, who's a singer, performer, and musicologist. And I suppose the way that we approached this was that these printed text, whether it's a musical score or dramatic or prose words on a page, that you need to read them as scripts, that they are full of cues that help you think about how they're not exact, they don't give you the note shift. Erasmus complains that there aren't enough marks to help people read text aloud but you could see that how a bracket might work, or how and you can see how pauses work in some texts. So, but I think it's really helpful to have one's attention drawn to literary and musical text side by side. And we certainly wanted to make sure that people saw musical text, printed text, as the text I'll be looking at as eminently performable. So, but thank you very much for that question.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'll just pick out a final one. We're coming up to 6:30, so we've kept you for quite a while now. So this last question is from John Goodwin, and it's about the performance history of The Fatal Contract. So he asks, has it been performed? How often? And how do you think a modern audience would react to it in performance?
So that's the last one is the $1 million question, is their reaction. But so in the restoration, Elkanah Settle adapts The Fatal Contract under the title Love and Revenge, and it's performed in the restoration with a woman in the part of Castrato. Although blackface isn't used, it's a masked role. Since then, I have found no evidence of any performance of The Fatal Contract at all, with one exception, and that's Carol Morley, who does a scholarly edition of The Fatal Contract some years ago. And in private correspondence, she talked to me about a performance that she directed at the University of Birmingham. I think it was in the 80s, and as part of her kind of research, as part of her edition of the general works of William Hemming. And she, so again, academic context for the performance. And I do know that she cast, as Castrato, she did cast a woman. She cast, the woman was of Sri Lankan descent. And there was sort of an attempt to preserve the disguise device, but the audience would have recognized certainly that the actor was a woman playing the role. So that's the only contemporary performance of this play. And again, right before the pandemic, we were going to do a staged reading here at the U of I with the faculty and the MFA students in the theater department. I don't know when we can go back to doing these sorts of things, but I become, I think, increasingly hesitant about how to do this play. Like I mean, I think we can all think of the reasons like why it might be seriously objectionable. I mean, it would involve so much explanation and context before even a staged reading of it. That's not to say that I don't think it would be worthwhile doing, but I think it would be, I don't know that this play has a life in commercial performance at all, certainly. And I think the only life that it would have would be as a sort of intellectual exercise, as a way to illustrate this particular convention and how racial disguise conventions kind of worked. That's my take on it right now. I did perform a little bit of it in a class. So I was teaching a class with MFAs, and they staged bits of it. And I have to say, in performance, like it was very affecting. It was far more emotionally kind of urgent and sincere, the way that the two actors actually performed this turn from violence to confession to reconciliation. I was surprised by how it worked. But yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrea. I'm going to squeeze in one more question for Jenny, if that's okay, if you're happy to keep going for a couple of minutes. It's from Sonia Masai, and she asks, does your forthcoming edition of Nash's complete works attribute all typography or only expressive typography to Nash? How have you guided your editors when it comes to interpreting punctuation as significant/insignificant? And does the apparatus draw attention to typesetting practice as opposed to authorial intervention? Or were your it's a meaty question, or were your editors encouraged to consider the interplay between the different agents in charge of pointing the text as significant?
Right. Okay. These are really good questions. And it's very complicated. I mean, we can't be categorical about this, and we're not sure that. Obviously, we can't say that the pointing is Nash's. In manuscript, the only one manuscript we've got uses the comma. That's Morley uses, but that's common. The transfer from manuscript to print, the pointing can change. We're not proposing that he's always responsible for the pointing or other typographical features. I mean, there are different features that suggest theatricality. Some of them are written into the text, and then that's him in character. Those moves that he makes, or the figures that he chooses, and that we can choose that can guide our pronunciation, our delivery of the text. But what we were really focusing on are those few moments where it's clear that he is involved in rethinking the punctuation. What I really want to say is the thing that surprised me most about Nash is he changed my mind about what is an accidental and what is a substantive. So we found that it went against our expectation that when we were doing the collation, that I mean, there are not many examples. I don't want to exaggerate and make this sound like this phenomenal new discovery, but we found in the case of Lenten Stuff that he removes letters from words in order to add punctuation marks that were not there when he's correcting the text. So we haven't been strict with editors. We've asked people, basically all we've done is say, before you make a change to punctuation, sometimes you do need to do that because it's really not clear. Sometimes it is a mistake. Just make sure that you understand the rhetorical function of the sentence, because these are long sentences. They can go on for half a page or something. But just make sure, because you find in the J.B. Steen edition that he adds grammatical punctuation. But in fact, sometimes if you don't understand that the sentence is a thought that has different parts, then you miss its meaning. So that's the only advice that we've given. So, but Sonia, it's a pity we can't have an open conversation about this. I'd love to hear what you think.
I was muted whilst talking then. But I was just going to say perhaps you can catch up on email after the seminar, hopefully. Yeah, it is a shame not to be able to have people's faces pop up. Maybe that's something we can work on for future seminars. But yeah, I think maybe we should bring things to a close now. You've both worked really hard over the last hour and a bit. So thank you both very much. It was fantastic hearing more about your work. And thank you also to everyone who asked questions. The next seminar, just to quickly announce it whilst I've got you all here, is November the 2nd, and it's focusing on eco-criticism and animal studies. And we have Todd Borlik, and his paper is entitled Timon of Athens, the Scottish Gold Rush and the Folio's Gold as Vibrant Matter. And also Rebecca Ann Bach, who's talking about clocks and cocks in Shakespeare, time in the creaturely world. So I hope to see lots of you again on the 2nd of November at the same time. And once again, thanks very much to Andrea and Jennifer for fascinating talks this evening. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye.